My name is Dorothy Hallett, and at 74 years old, I was the kind of woman who clipped grocery coupons on Sunday mornings and kept the thermostat at 64 degrees from November through March, because the gas bill didn't care how cold it got outside. I wasn't poor. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I was careful. There's a difference, though some months that difference felt thinner than I like to admit. I had my late husband's small pension, my Social Security, and a part-time bookkeeping job I'd kept at a local hardware store 3 days a week because the owner was 81 and needed someone who still understood a paper ledger. I also cleaned houses on Fridays. 2 houses, both belonging to women younger than my own children, which I mention not for sympathy, but for accuracy. At 74, I was on my knees scrubbing other people's baseboards on Friday afternoons, and nobody in my family knew it because I hadn't told them, and they hadn't asked. That was the arrangement we'd all silently agreed to. I was fine. I was always fine. Dorothy Hallett was the sturdy one, the one who managed, the one you didn't worry about. So when my son Clifton sat across from me at his own dining room table on a warm September evening, surrounded by his beautiful home and his successful life, and the people he loved most, and smiled at me with genuine warmth and asked how that $9,000 monthly check was treating me, I nearly choked on my water. Because in 4 years, I had never seen a single dollar of it. Not one. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. My name is Dorothy, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my daughter-in-law cashed my son's love for me, month after month, for 4 years, and how I sat at that same dinner table and laid it out in front of everyone who mattered. No screaming, no dramatics, just the truth, turned face up in the light where nobody could look away from it. If a steady hand and a long overdue reckoning are your kind of story, stay with me, subscribe if you haven't, and settle in because this one takes a minute to unwrap. It's worth it. Let me tell you who I was before any of this happened, because the story only makes sense if you know the woman it happened to. I raised 2 children, Clifton and my daughter Renata, in a 3-bedroom house in Greensboro, North Carolina, on a schoolteacher's salary and whatever my husband Leonard could pull in from his electrical contracting work. Leonard was a good man, a quiet man, the kind who fixed things without being asked and never raised his voice in 31 years of marriage. He died of a sudden cardiac event 12 years ago on a Tuesday morning while he was getting dressed for work, and I became a widow at 62 in a way that felt less like losing half of myself and more like losing the floor entirely. I rebuilt. That's what you do. You rebuild because the alternative isn't really an alternative. Clifton was 34 when his father died. He'd already started climbing by then, working in commercial real estate development out of Charlotte, the kind of work that rewards a certain kind of relentless intelligence, which Clifton had in abundance from the time he could argue both sides of any question before breakfast. He was successful. More than successful, really. By the time this story takes place, he was genuinely wealthy in a way that still surprised me when I visited his house, which had more square footage than my entire street growing up. He married Vanessa 9 years ago. She was beautiful in the way of women who understand that beauty is also a project, always polished, always assembled. She came from money herself, or had come adjacent to it long enough to adopt all its gestures. She was warm to me in the way that certain people are warm, which is to say precisely as warm as the situation required, never more. I didn't dislike her. I want to say that plainly. Disliking her would have required me to pay closer attention than I had, and I'd been too busy managing my own life to study hers. She and Clifton seemed content. They had a daughter named Bree, who was 6 and already had her father's eyes and her mother's self-possession. I visited on holidays and sent birthday cards and kept my distance because Vanessa was the kind of woman who maintained her perimeter graciously, and I respected perimeters. Renata, my daughter, lived 40 minutes away from me in Winston-Salem. She was 47, unmarried, a dental hygienist who worked long hours and spent her weekends renovating a small house she'd bought 5 years ago. She and I talked twice a week and had lunch on the second Saturday of every month without fail. She was the one who knew about the Friday houses and the thermostat and the coupons, because Renata paid attention the way some people just do, and she'd started leaving groceries on my porch occasionally without mentioning it, which I pretended not to notice. That was our family. Clifton with his success and his beautiful wife and his Charlotte mansion. Renata with her Saturday lunches and her quiet loyalty. And me, Dorothy, the sturdy one in the coupon-clipped middle. It was a fine arrangement, until the September dinner, until Clifton smiled across his own table and asked about the check. The evening started the way those evenings always started at Clifton and Vanessa's house, beautifully. She was a gifted host. I'll give her that without reservation. The table was set with the kind of care that communicates effort without showing it, which is actually the hardest kind of care. The food was catered but plated as though she'd made it. The wine was exactly right. The lighting was warm. Bree had been put to bed at a strategic hour. Everything was arranged for comfort and ease and the particular impression of a family that had its life exactly where it wanted it. There were 8 of us at the table. Clifton and Vanessa. Vanessa's parents, Gordon and Sylvia Marsh, who lived an hour away and attended most family gatherings as though monitoring an investment. Renata, who'd driven up and brought flowers she'd grown herself. 2 of Clifton's colleagues from his development firm, a couple named the Hartwells, who were apparently being cultivated for something, the way Clifton cultivated people. And me. I sat beside Renata and ate the perfectly catered food, and made polite conversation with Gordon Marsh about the interest rate environment, which he found more interesting than I did, and watched my son move through his own home with the ease of a man who had built something real and knew it. He was happy. That's what I kept thinking, watching him across the table. My son was genuinely happy, and whatever mixture of pride and grief that produced in me was mine to manage, not his problem. We were deep into the main course, conversation flowing in the comfortable overlapping way of people who aren't quite strangers, but haven't run out of surface topics yet, when Clifton set down his fork, looked at me, and his face took on that particular warm expression I'd known since he was a boy. The one that meant he was proud of something and wanted to say so. "Mom," he said, and the table quieted slightly in the way tables do when the host speaks directly to someone. He smiled, that big easy Clifton smile. "How's that $9,000 monthly check treating you? Getting the rest you've earned?" I heard every word with perfect clarity. I understood immediately that he meant it sincerely, that he believed he was asking about money that had been reaching me, that he had every expectation I would say something warm about how it had made a difference. I also understood, in the same instant, that I had never received a single payment. Not $1, not 1 month, not once. The water glass was halfway to my mouth. I set it down. Across the table, Vanessa reached for the bread basket, a small, ordinary gesture, but I was watching her hands and they were slightly too deliberate, and she did not look at me. That was the tell. 4 years of experience being a social worker's daughter taught me that the person who doesn't look at you when the unexpected thing is said is the person who already knew the unexpected thing was coming. I looked at Vanessa's hands on the bread basket. I looked at Clifton's open, expectant face. I looked at Renata beside me, who had gone very still. Then I said, with a smile I'd been perfecting for 74 years, "Well, Clifton, that is something I'd love to talk with you about. Not tonight though, sweetheart. Tonight's too lovely for bookkeeping." He laughed. The table moved on. Vanessa finally looked up, and her eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction of a second, we both understood something. She knew what I'd just discovered. And I knew that she knew. And neither of us said a word about it over the rest of that beautiful, perfectly catered dinner. But driving home that night, I called Renata before I'd cleared the neighborhood. "Natty," I said, using the name I'd called her since she was 3 years old, "I need you to tell me if Clifton has ever mentioned sending me money." A pause, a very specific kind of pause. "He told me 2 years ago he'd set something up for you," she said carefully. "A monthly arrangement. He said you'd finally agreed to let him help after he pushed you on it." I watched the highway lights slide over my windshield. "I never agreed to anything," I said. Another pause. "Dorothy," she said. "She only called me Dorothy when something was serious." "How much?" $9,000 a month, I said. "For 4 years, apparently." The silence on the line had a particular quality. Then Renata said, very quietly, That's over $400,000. I know, I said. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off. The letter from the accounting firm arrived 3 days later, and I want you to understand that I wasn't surprised by it. Not because I'd expected it, but because by the time it came, I'd already spent 3 days quietly preparing myself for whatever confirmation the universe intended to deliver. It was addressed to me in Greensboro. It referenced, in the affectless language of financial administration, the ongoing disbursement schedule established on behalf of Mr. Clifton Hallett for the benefit of his mother, Dorothy Hallett. It included a summary of 4 years of monthly payments, beginning at $5,500 and increasing to $9,000 over time. I sat at my kitchen table and did the arithmetic. $438,000, give or take. My son had been sending me $9,000 a month for 4 years. And in 4 years of scrubbing baseboards on Friday afternoons and keeping the thermostat at 64 degrees and clipping coupons on Sunday mornings, I had not seen $1 of any of it. I went through 4 years of bank statements that afternoon with the focused attention of a woman who spent 30 years keeping other people's books. I already knew what I'd find, but I needed the documented confirmation. There was nothing. No deposit, no partial payment, no anomaly. My account was exactly what it appeared to be, the account of a woman who managed carefully and asked no one for anything. I sat with the statements spread across my kitchen table and thought very clearly about several things in order. First, someone had been receiving my son's money in my name. Second, whoever that was, they had done it for long enough and in large enough amounts to indicate this was not a mistake or a clerical error. This was a system. Third, Vanessa's hands on the bread basket. Vanessa not looking at me when Clifton asked his question. Vanessa, who I had observed for 9 years as a woman who managed information the way she managed dinner parties, carefully, completely, never accidentally. Fourth, my son believed I had agreed to this arrangement, which meant someone had communicated that agreement to him on my behalf. In my name. I folded the statements carefully. I made a cup of coffee. I sat by the window and watched the yard for a little while, the way you do when you need your mind to work without your eyes in the way. Then I called a legal aid referral line and made an appointment for the following Tuesday. And the next Friday, I went to the 2 houses and cleaned them, because the rent didn't pause for betrayal, and neither did I. The attorney I was connected with through the referral was a woman named Helen Prater, and she worked out of a small office in downtown Greensboro with a filing system that looked chaotic and functioned, I would come to learn, with impressive precision. She was somewhere in her late 50s, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having heard a great many variations of human behavior without running out of patience for any of them. I told her everything from the beginning. The dinner, the question, the letter, the bank statements, the bread basket. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked 3 careful questions, took 2 pages of notes, and then leaned back and explained to me the legal geography I was standing in. Your son writes the checks, she said. He's the payer, and you're the named payee. If someone intercepted those payments and deposited them into an account that isn't yours, the fraud lives on the endorsement. The back of the check where your name is signed. The front is legitimate. The bank processes it without a second look. It's clean on the surface and criminal underneath. And to see the backs, I said, following the shape of it, I need Clifton, as the payer. She nodded. Only he has standing to authorize the bank to release the endorsement images without a court order. And a court order takes considerably longer than you may want to wait. I thought about that. So my son needs to believe me, I said, before I have the proof that would make him believe me. Helen Prater looked at me over her reading glasses for a moment. That's the trap, she said simply. His trust in his wife is the lock on the box, and she's had 4 years to maintain that trust very carefully. She let that sit, then she added the piece that changed the temperature of everything. But I want you to understand what category of offense you may be looking at. If your name was signed by another person's hand to deposit checks meant for you, that's a forged endorsement. Combined with any correspondence written in your name to establish or maintain the arrangement, and you'd be looking at forgery and potentially theft by deception under North Carolina statute. These are not small classifications. I drove home thinking about the word correspondence, because it had been sitting in the back of my mind since Clifton said the words "getting the rest you've earned" with that particular warmth. The warmth of a man who believed he'd been receiving grateful confirmation. Someone had been thanking him, in my name, for money I never received, regularly enough that he'd never thought to question it. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The correspondence was the part I didn't have yet, but I was beginning to understand that it existed, and that when I found it, it would be the part that changed the shape of everything. I gave Vanessa one opportunity, because I'm a woman who believes in one opportunity. I want that on the record, not to make myself noble, but because it mattered to me later that I'd offered the door before I walked around the wall. I called her on a Thursday afternoon and kept my voice entirely ordinary. "Vanessa," I said, "I want to ask you something directly. Has Clifton set up any kind of financial arrangement for me that comes through you?" The pause on the line was exactly 3 seconds. I counted. "Dorothy," she said warmly, with just a touch of gentle concern underneath the warmth, "I think you may be confused about something. Clifton handles so much, it can be hard to follow. Why don't I have him call you?" I said that would be lovely. He didn't call. 48 hours passed, and my son did not call, which told me that Vanessa had not passed on the message, or had passed it in a form specifically designed to produce no callback. I filed that information where it belonged. Then I called Renata and told her it was time to move to the next step, and I asked her if she still had the contact information for the paralegal her friend had used during her divorce proceedings 2 years ago. She did. The paralegal's name was Josie Tremblay, and she was technically not a lawyer but knew more about how money moved through family systems than most lawyers I'd have been able to afford. She agreed to help me for a flat fee that I paid with 3 weeks of Friday house money, which I did without flinching, because some investments are more important than others. Josie pulled public records. She ran what she called a paper trail analysis, cross-referencing deposit patterns, account openings, and what she could access through public filings. She found it within a week. An account had been opened in my name at a credit union in Charlotte 4 years and 2 months ago, a joint account. The secondary holder was listed as Vanessa Hallett. The deposits into that account, according to the partial records Josie could access, lined up perfectly with the disbursement schedule in the accounting firm's letter. 11 transfers in the partial window she could see. 11 times the money arrived and kept moving into an account with my name on the front and Vanessa's access underneath. I looked at the account opening date, 4 years and 2 months ago. I thought about what had been happening in my life 4 years and 2 months ago. I'd been recovering from a minor surgery. I'd been distracted and grateful and leaning slightly more than usual on the people around me. Clifton and Vanessa had visited for a long weekend. During that weekend, I'd signed several things: insurance updates, a new form for the pension beneficiary designation, standard paperwork that Vanessa had helpfully organized and walked me through because Clifton was on a work call and she'd offered. I thought about how many things I'd signed in that kitchen over 3 days. I thought about how a joint account application might look if it was slipped between 2 forms you'd already agreed to sign. How a tired woman recovering from surgery might not read every line of every page when the person organizing the paperwork had a pleasant voice and a warm manner and was married to your son. I sat with that possibility for a long time. I didn't let myself be certain of it because I hadn't confirmed it, but I held it as a working theory with a considerable amount of evidence pointing in its direction. I called Helen Prater and told her what Josie had found. Helen was quiet for a moment. "With the account and Clifton's authorization," she said, "we can request the endorsement images formally. That's the piece that makes everything else provable instead of probable." "I need Clifton," I said. "You need Clifton," she confirmed. Getting to my son without going through Vanessa was the central problem of the next 2 weeks, and I want you to understand how carefully I had to think about it. Vanessa was good at her position. She had spent 4 years refining the apparatus of a loving daughter-in-law who happened to manage all communication in and out of her household with a deftness that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. She answered his phone when I called and he was busy. She mentioned his schedule in ways that limited windows. She was always pleasant, always warm, always exactly present enough to redirect without appearing to redirect. I'd watched her do it for 9 years and thought it was simply her personality. Organized, involved, devoted. It took one question, about a check, to understand what I'd actually been watching. I needed to get to Clifton directly, which meant I needed to do it outside any channel she monitored. My solution was Renata. Renata called her brother. Not from my phone, not about me, not with any flag that might raise Vanessa's awareness. She called him on a Tuesday morning when she knew from long habit that he drove to his office alone, a 20-minute window when his phone was his own. She told him she'd heard something she needed him to hear directly. That it was about Mom, and that it was serious enough that she needed him to call me himself from his work phone before he went home that evening. Renata told me later that the call lasted 11 minutes. That Clifton was quiet for most of it. That when he spoke, his voice had the particular flatness of a man keeping himself very controlled. He called me from his office at 6:47 that evening. I know the time because I'd been watching the clock since 4. Mom, his voice was careful. Tell me what you know. I told him slowly and in order. I kept my voice even. I didn't editorialize, didn't speculate out loud, just laid the documented facts in a line, the letter from the accounting firm. The bank statements with nothing in them, the account in my name at the Charlotte Credit Union, the deposit timing that matched perfectly with his disbursement schedule. He was quiet for a long time. I set this up for you 4 years ago, he said, after you had the surgery. We talked about it. You were resistant. Vanessa sat with you at the kitchen table and went through the paperwork and you signed everything. I thought you'd finally agreed to let me take care of you. I know, I said gently. Clifton, what did I sign? Another long silence. Vanessa handled all of it, he said. I know, I said again. The silence on the line had a different quality now. The quality of a very intelligent man reorganizing what he thought he knew into a shape he didn't like at all. He asked me what I needed from him. I told him about Helen Prater. I told him about the endorsement images, the bank's requirement, his authorization as the check writer. I told him that with his signature on the right document, we would have proof that no amount of explanation could soften. And then I told him what I wanted to do with that proof. He didn't agree immediately. I want to be honest about that. There was a part of my son that wanted to handle it quietly, between himself and Vanessa, in the privacy of their own home. He's a man who solves things and believes he can solve most things if the room is small enough. I understand that impulse. I also understood that if it happened behind closed doors, Vanessa would be in that room, and Vanessa was very good in rooms. I told him the truth about that plainly. Clifton, I said, you're a good man and I know you want to protect your family. But she's been doing this for 4 years and she's been very careful and very smart about it. If you take this to her in private, she will explain it to you. She'll have reasons. She'll have a version of it that makes me sound confused and her sound like she was solving a problem I wasn't willing to solve myself. And you'll want to believe her because she's your wife and you love her and it's easier. He was quiet. I need witnesses, I said, not to punish her, to protect the truth. Because without witnesses, Clifton, her version of this becomes the family's version, and I've been the quiet one long enough. The silence went on for a while. Then he said, when's Bree's school holiday weekend? I think we have something coming up. I told him I'd check. The occasion that assembled itself was Clifton's annual fall gathering, a dinner he hosted every October for his closest business associates and family, 12 to 15 people, a tradition he'd started when he and Vanessa first moved into the Charlotte house. Vanessa planned it every year with considerable attention to detail. It was, in every sense, her event. I want you to sit with that for a moment. She had been spending my son's money for 4 years. And the room where it would finally come to light was a party she had designed, at a table she had set, in a house that my son's generosity had helped maintain. I did not arrange the occasion. The occasion arranged itself, which is sometimes how justice works. Quietly, without fanfare, into exactly the right configuration. Vanessa called me 3 weeks before to invite me, warm as always, and mentioned she was also inviting Renata, which she'd started doing 2 years ago because Clifton liked having family at these things. She mentioned that the Hartwells would be there again, and the Flemings from his office, and Gordon and Sylvia, her parents. 14 people, 11 of whom had known Clifton and me for years. Her parents, who would be a complication but a manageable one, and an attorney named Philip Acaffer, whom Helen Prater had agreed to introduce as a colleague attending as a personal guest. Philip was a forensic financial specialist who could, if needed, explain the contents of my folder to a room of non-lawyers in language precise enough to be undeniable. He would be just a guest, until he wasn't. I told Vanessa I'd love to come, and asked if I could bring the sweet potato casserole that Clifton always requested. Of course, she said warmly, he'll be so happy. I said I was sure he would. In the 21 days between that phone call and the October dinner, I built the file. Helen Prater filed the formal request for the endorsement images with Clifton's written authorization attached. The bank took 9 business days to respond. What came back was 47 months of check images, front and back, every one of them. On the front of each check, Clifton's handwriting, his firm, legible signature. Pay to the order of Dorothy Hallett, the amount climbing over the years from $5,500 to $9,000, always written with the care of a man who meant the gesture. On the back of each check, my name, Dorothy Hallett, signed in a confident, flowing cursive that was not my handwriting in any particular whatsoever. I have small, compressed, left-leaning handwriting from 40 years of keeping ledgers and margins. The signature on the backs of those checks was round and expansive and nothing like mine. Beneath each signature, a deposit account number. The same account number all 47 months. The same account number that appeared in the joint account Josie had found in Charlotte. The account with my name on the opening documents and Vanessa's access on the inside. I photographed the endorsement images. I printed 3 of them, the earliest, the largest, and the most recent, one from each year of the arrangement. I put them in a plain manila folder with one additional document, a letter Helen Prater had obtained from the accounting firm's file. The letter was from the beneficiary, from me, from Dorothy Hallett. Except it wasn't from me. It was dated 16 months ago, and it requested, in a warm and articulate voice that captured my general cadence well enough to be convincing, that the monthly amount be increased from $7,000 to $9,000 as I had recently taken on some additional expenses related to my housing situation, and Clifton's continued generosity was such a blessing. I had not written that letter. I had not requested an increase. I had not, at the point that letter was sent, even known an arrangement existed. But someone had written to my son in my voice and asked for more of his money. And he had adjusted the amount within the month because he loved his mother and believed she needed it. 47 months. From $5,500 to $9,000, negotiated upward in my name without my knowledge. That letter went into the folder behind the 3 checks. 4 documents total. Helen had said what she said about walls of paper looking like vendettas. 4 documents looked like proof. I was ready. The night before the dinner, I almost didn't sleep. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story, where I was perfectly calm and perfectly confident from beginning to end, isn't quite true, and I think you deserve the real version. I sat in my kitchen at 11:30 at night in my robe, with a cup of tea and a folder on the table, and thought about every possible way the next 24 hours could go sideways. Clifton changing his mind. Vanessa somehow getting wind of it and controlling the narrative before it started. The documents being insufficient. The room not believing me. I thought about Bree, upstairs in that house with her particular eyes and her mother's composure, 6 years old and completely innocent of everything. I thought about what the next year of her life would look like after tomorrow, and whether what I was about to do to her parents' marriage was something I could live with. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it honestly. And then I thought about 47 months. About 4 years of Fridays on my knees in other people's houses. About the thermostat at 64 degrees, and the coin collection, and the coupons, and the particular, low hum of financial anxiety that had become so constant, I'd stopped hearing it as unusual. I thought about my son, who had spent 4 years believing he was taking care of his mother, receiving warm letters of gratitude from a woman who was actually on her hands and knees every Friday because she needed the money. I thought about the relationship that had been stolen from us. Not just the money, the relationship. The trust and the connection and the genuine comfort my son had been trying to give me, intercepted and spent before it ever reached me. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money. She'd stolen 4 years of my son, knowing his mother was truly all right. I put my robe on tighter and drank my tea and made my peace with what morning would bring. Then I went to bed. I slept 6 hours, which for a 74-year-old woman the night before something important is honestly pretty good. I want to describe Vanessa's house the way it looked that October evening, because some things deserve to be seen clearly before they change. She'd done the table in harvest colors. Deep orange and burgundy linens, candles in bronze holders, small gourds arranged with the kind of artless precision that takes real effort to achieve. The house smelled of something warm and spiced that was probably a candle rather than actual cooking, but it didn't matter, it was beautiful. She greeted me at the door in a deep green dress that made her look like someone from a magazine, hugged me with the warmth she always produced on command, exclaimed about my sweet potato casserole, and walked me into a room full of people who were glad to see each other. Clifton came to me immediately. He hugged me the way he'd hugged me since he was big enough to put his arms around properly, and when he pulled back his eyes were steady and telling me he was ready. I squeezed his hand and said his dinner looked beautiful. He said, "Thanks, Mom," in a voice that meant something different than the words. I found my seat. The folder was in the tote bag by my chair. Philip Ackhaffer was near the window with a glass of sparkling water, talking to one of the Fleming couples from Clifton's office, looking for all the world like a man at a pleasant October dinner. Renata sat beside me and put her hand briefly over mine under the table. "I know," I said quietly. She nodded. Vanessa moved through the room like a woman who owned it, which in some sense she believed she did. Gracious, composed, holding everything together with the invisible effort of the very practiced host. I watched her and understood that she felt safe. She had managed this for 4 years. She had managed me at the birthday dinner when Clifton asked his question. She had managed Clifton's instinct to call me by not delivering the message. She was very good at managing things, and she had every reason to believe this evening was simply another thing she was managing. She had no idea what was in the tote bag. We were through the main course. The table was warm and full, and relaxed in the way of people who have eaten well and are on their second glass of wine and feel that the evening belongs to them. Clifton stood. He didn't tap a glass, he didn't make a performance of it. He simply stood, and the table settled toward him the way tables settle toward hosts, naturally, without being asked. He looked around the room at the people he'd invited, his friends and colleagues and family, and he said he wanted to say something before the evening went much further. He looked down the table at me. "I've spent 4 years believing I was taking care of my mother," he said. His voice was easy, conversational. The voice of a man who decided to say a thing and was saying it without apology. He smiled at me, and it wasn't a performance. It was my son. "Mom," he said, "I have to ask you something I should have asked directly a long time ago." The table was smiling, warm, leaning into what everyone expected to be a sweet toast. Gordon Marsh lifted his wine glass slightly in anticipation. One of the Fleming wives was already getting that pleasant pre-tears look. Clifton looked at me with the same open warmth he'd had at the birthday dinner, but this time we both knew what was underneath it. "Has that $9,000 a month ever reached you? Any of it, any month?" The table paused, a different kind of pause than they'd expected. I set down my fork. I felt 14 faces turn toward me, comfortable and curious, waiting for me to say something warm about my generous son. I felt Vanessa, 3 seats to Clifton's right, go very still in the particular way of a woman who had just felt the floor shift. "No," I said clearly, "not $1, not 1 month, not in 4 years." The room absorbed that. Then I reached into the tote bag. I placed 3 checks on the table in front of me, face up, side by side in the amber candlelight. Clifton's handwriting on every one. Clear, deliberate, unmistakable to everyone at that table who'd ever seen his signature on a document. Pay to the order of Dorothy Hallett, $9,000, $9,000. $9,000, 3 months of 47. The table leaned in, reading. The Fleming couple near the center exchanged a glance. Renata's hands were flat on the tablecloth. Gordon Marsh had set down his wine glass. My son has been sending me this every month, I said, and my voice came out the way I needed it to, steady and clear and without heat. These are 3 of 47 checks. I never saw a dollar of any of them. I let that sit exactly long enough. Then I said, turn them over. Philip Acaffer was closest to one. He reached over and turned it face down. On the back was my name, Dorothy Hallett, signed in a confident, looping hand that no one in that room who'd known me for more than a year would recognize as mine. Beneath the signature, a deposit account number. The same number on all 3. Clifton picked up the second check himself. He turned it over with the controlled deliberateness of a man who already knew what he'd see and had decided to see it anyway, in front of witnesses, because that was what the situation required. He read the account number aloud, flat, each digit separate. Then he put the check down on the table and looked at his wife. Vanessa, he said, is that our joint account number? I have seen people cornered before. 30 years in social services, you develop an accurate catalog of what a person looks like when the story they've been maintaining runs out of room. Vanessa Hallett was a composed and intelligent woman, and she didn't fall apart the way a less composed person might. She reorganized. Quickly. The expression that crossed her face was brief and complex, and then it was gone, and what replaced it was something I can only describe as a managed pivot. She looked around the table, and she aimed her first words at the people in the room she assessed as most likely to accept a reframe. She looked at her parents. We were managing the situation, she said. Her voice was careful and warm and persuasive. Dorothy has always refused help. You know how she is. She would never have accepted money from Clifton directly. We found a way to make it practical, to use it for the family, for things that needed doing. She said for the family, the way people say it when they mean for me. Gordon Marsh's expression shifted slightly and not in the direction she'd counted on. He was a man who'd spent 40 years in commercial lending and understood what account numbers meant. Clifton, she turned to her husband now, her voice dropping into the register she used when it was just the 2 of them. You know how much I've managed for this family. You know what I've held together. My son looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he said, you signed her name Vanessa. Not a question, a statement. The room was completely silent. The candles were the loudest thing in it. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. I looked at my daughter-in-law across the candlelit table and kept my voice quiet enough that the room had to hold its breath to hear me. 47 months, I said, from 5,500 to 9,000. And a letter you wrote in my name asking for the increase, because that's in the file too. I reached into the tote bag one last time and placed the 4th document on the table. The letter. 16 months old, warm and personal and written in a voice that had studied mine carefully. Signed Dorothy Hallett in that same looping hand. I laid it beside the checks. There it was, all of it. On a table set with harvest colors in a house that my son's money had kept beautiful, in front of 14 people who would remember exactly what they'd seen. Philip Acaffer set down his sparkling water. He introduced himself then, quietly and precisely, and explained his professional background to the table in 2 sentences. Then he looked at the documents and addressed the room. What you're looking at, he said, is a forged endorsement on a series of negotiable instruments over 47 months, combined with fraudulent correspondence written under the payee's name to establish and escalate the arrangement. Under North Carolina statute, the endorsement alone constitutes forgery. The correspondence requesting increased payments constitutes a separate pattern of deception. Together, these are criminal matters. The documentation supporting both is already with the appropriate parties. He said it the way a weatherman reads a forecast, not to frighten anyone, just to name what was actually in the air. Forgery, deception, criminal matters. The words moved through the room, like something cold through a warm space. Vanessa's mother made a small sound. Her father had gone very still. And Vanessa, the composed and beautiful and very careful Vanessa, looked at me for a long moment with something in her face I couldn't quite name. Not remorse, not exactly. Something more like the expression of a person who had calculated everything except the one variable that had mattered most. She had calculated money and access, and my silence and Clifton's trust, and the comfort of distance. She had not calculated that the quiet old woman who cleaned houses on Fridays had spent 30 years learning exactly how people managed things they didn't want seen, and was very patient, and had decided that enough was enough. Clifton spoke then. His voice was quiet and final. "You need to leave the table," he said to his wife. "We'll talk later, not here." She left the table. Gordon and Sylvia followed her. The room recalibrated in the way rooms do after something permanent has happened, quietly and without a script, people finding small things to say or choosing to say nothing, the Fleming couple offering to help clear the table, Renata's hand finding mine under the tablecloth. Clifton sat down beside me. He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Mom, 4 years." "I know," I said. "On my knees in those Friday houses." "I know." He put his head in his hands briefly, then straightened, the way he'd learned from his father, the straightening up. "I should have called more," he said. "I thought the arrangement meant you were all right. I thought I was reaching you." "You were," I said. "She just stood in the way." He nodded. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I put my hand on my son's arm. He was 53 years old and he was still my boy. "Don't be sorry," I told him. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." What followed took the better part of a year, and it was neither clean nor simple, and I won't pretend otherwise. The restitution proceedings were handled through Helen Prater, and a family law attorney Clifton retained separately. The criminal investigation was opened by the appropriate authorities, who, once they saw the 47 months of forged endorsements combined with the fraudulent correspondence requesting increases, took it with the seriousness Philip Ockhafer had predicted. Forgery charges and theft by deception, as of the time I'm telling you this, remain under active review. The marriage did not survive. I want to say that plainly and without satisfaction because it is not a satisfying thing, regardless of what Vanessa had done. My son's marriage ended, and my granddaughter Bree is growing up in a divided household, and that is a cost no restitution schedule repays. What I can tell you is that Clifton and Bree now have dinner at my house every other Sunday, and last February he sat at my kitchen table and watched me clip coupons and told me that was done now, Mom, and I could stop. And I told him I'd think about it, which is what you say when someone offers you something that would take some getting used to. The Friday houses I ended. Not because I had to, but because 74 is old enough to have earned a free Friday. The thermostat is at 68 now. It felt extravagant for the first month. It feels normal now. Renata still brings groceries sometimes. I still pretend not to notice. Some things are worth keeping. Here's what I want to say before I close this out. Because I think some of you are sitting somewhere tonight with a question you haven't asked yet about money, or who handles it, or who stands between you and the generosity someone thinks they're sending you. Ask it. I spent 4 years in careful want, while someone else spent my son's love for me on a lifestyle I never knew about. Not because I was foolish. Not because I wasn't paying attention. But because I trusted the arrangement the way you trust a door to still be a door, without checking whether someone has changed the lock. Check the lock. Ask who handles the paperwork. Ask to see the confirmation. Ask the question that feels rude because money makes people feel rude. You are allowed to know the specifics of your own financial life. You are allowed to ask your generous son directly, to your face, what was set up and where it goes, and whether your name is on the receiving end of it. Vanessa counted on my pride and my silence and my lifelong habit of managing without asking. She was right about all 3 of those things. She was wrong about whether they'd last forever. They lasted 4 years. Then I turned 3 checks face down on a table in front of 14 witnesses and stopped being the quiet one for good. On my refrigerator, beside a photo of Leonard from the summer before he died, there is now a copy of one canceled check. My son's handwriting on the front, the forged signature on the back. I look at it every morning not to stay angry. That's expensive and I've always watched my expenses, but to stay clear. Because the check was never really about money. It was about whether someone could take your name and spend it without you ever knowing. The answer turned out to be no, not forever, not if you pay attention, not if you finally look up from the gas gauge and ask the question you should have asked years ago. That's my story. 4 years, 47 checks, and one dinner table where the truth ran out of places to hide. If this reached you tonight in a place that needed reaching, share it with someone else who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are in your own story. Subscribe if you haven't yet. And I'll see you in the next one. The quiet ones always have the best stories. They've just been waiting for the right moment to tell them.